Rzecznik finansowy jest niezależną instytucją. Pomagamy poprzez bezpłatne porady, interwencje oraz pomoc w procesach sądowych osobom będącym w sporach z bankami i firmami ubezpieczeniowymi. Naszym kapitałem jest zaangażowany zespół wykwalifikowanych prawników. Na nasz wniosek Sąd Najwyższy rozstrzyga w wątpliwych sprawach, często na korzyść konsumenta. Rzecznik Generalny TSUE przychylił się do stanowiska rzecznika finansowego w głośnej sprawie kredytów frankowych. Wspieramy obywateli, prowadząc szybkie i tanie postępowania ugodowe. Stanowią one alternatywę dla długotrwałych i kosztownych postępowań sądowych. Aktywnie uczestniczymy w tworzeniu prawa tak, aby przepisy jak najlepiej chroniły interesy klientów instytucji finansowych. Podczas spotkań zdalnych i stacjonarnych z mieszkańcami w całej Polsce uczymy rozwagi finansowej i ostrzegamy przed zagrożeniami. Kształcimy studentów w zakresie prawnej ochrony konsumentów. W tym celu tworzymy Akademię Rzecznika Finansowego. Codziennie stoimy na straży Waszych finansów.
Szanowni Państwo, bardzo proszę, abyśmy powoli zajmowali miejsca. Jest 9:45, a zatem czas zaczynać. Jeżeli ktoś z Państwa mnie słyszy, ale nie widzi, to znaczy, że jest w złym miejscu i bardzo proszę, żeby udawał się już na salę. Wiedziałam, że ktoś mnie słyszy, ale nie widzi. Nie zamkniemy drzwi, bo technikalia nam przeszkadzają, ale myślę, że możemy zacząć. Szanowni Państwo, bardzo serdecznie witam na konferencji Rzecznika Finansowego. Witam zarówno Państwa zgromadzonych na sali, jak i tych, którzy uczestniczą w konferencji za pośrednictwem łączności internetowej. Mam nadzieję, że wszystko się udało i transmisja trwa. Jest mi niezmiernie miło gościć Państwa na konferencji, która wpisuje się w tradycję konferencji Rzecznika Finansowego, a wcześniej Rzecznika Ubezpieczonych. Podczas naszych konferencji staramy się zawsze poruszać ważne tematy dla rynku finansowego, dla rynku ubezpieczeniowego i omawiać te problemy, które są szczególnie dla niego istotne, zwłaszcza dla tych jego uczestników, którzy są tymi słabszymi uczestnikami, a więc klientów, konsumentów. Mam nadzieję, że również i dzisiejszy temat Państwa zainspiruje i będzie właśnie taką płaszczyzną do tego, aby te ważne tematy poruszyć, a mówić będziemy o pozasądowym rozwiązywaniu sporów. Witam Państwa bardzo serdecznie w imieniu gospodarza dzisiejszej uroczystości, pana ministra Bogdana Pretkiela oraz jego zastępcy pana Zimowita Pogojewskiego, and on my own behalf, my name is Anna Gadomska and I'm director of the Department for Out-of-Court Dispute Settlement in the Financial Ombudsman's Office. So thank you very much for your contribution. I mean, all the speakers. I'd like to thank very much for coming. I'm happy that there are so many of you. So as regards disputes on financial services, it's a category that gives rise to most of the emotions among participants of such disputes, but the resolution of such disputes has a very important impact not only on the legal situation but also on the material situation, especially of consumers. And that's why, because an economic imbalance between the professional and non-professional participant in the dispute, so it's very important to
to have appropriate atmosphere and tools to resolve such a dispute. So out-of-court resolution of disputes does exist in the Polish law. It's court or out-of-court mediation, or in the form of arbitration. And we are happy to welcome Madam Arbiter, who would be one of our speakers at the conference. So I think we forget about one thing, that it is one of the crucial elements of the EU system for consumers' protection. It's no doubt that access to impartial knowledge, which meets all the information and expertise on out-of-court resolution of disputes, really has impact on the security of customers on the market, and at the same time that should also encourage customers to become part of the system, and they also meet the requirement of broad access to the legal dimension and legal protection. This is of particular importance in the case of the so-called minor disputes, where the selection of the court settlement is not profitable, I mean, from the financial viewpoint, or involvement of time and money. As an example, let me tell you that the average value of settlements resulting from disputes resolved in our department. So in the case of insurance cases, it is about 30,000 zlotys. That's the data for 2022. And in the case of banking trials, it's about 9,000 up to 10,000 Polish zlotys. So that's the medium amount of disputes resolution. Of course, there are much bigger amounts, several hundred thousand Polish zlotys, but on average it is like that. And that statistic shows that as regards these sort of minor disputes, which could be in the cognitive of regional courts, there is a need to really resolve them by ADRs, and the result of out-of-court resolution is not really fully exploited, and that pertains to professional and side and to consumers. Also, the potential does exist. So, as a very interesting thing, let me mention that since the beginnings of our department, that is from 2016, we've managed to make settlements in 2,700 cases, and the total value of all these settlements was almost 24 million Polish zlotys. So I think this is the amount which is really important, and it is almost 2,700 cases not referred to courts, and it means that it is 2,700 rebuilt relations of trust between the customer and its bank or the insurance institution, and whether the potential is exploited. Well, I hope the conference will answer this question, and the conference is being held prior to the important change to ADR in Poland and Europe, because as you know, the amendments to the directives on ADR are broadly now discussed. Unfortunately, I would say, because I think this tool has been really very good. Probably ODR platform will be eliminated because unfortunately it's not used. So we therefore change many challenges and changes. So even today, regardless of how the changes will go, it's worthwhile to discuss various solutions, experience, and I do hope that today's conference will give you an impetus for thinking about such things and to draw conclusions. So I wish you fruitful discussions. I hope you will stay with us until the end of the conference. And I think our agenda is really very interesting, and we will start with a great thing, that is the experience of are in selected EU
aby więcej na ten temat powiedziała nam
countries. So
pani
I first like Professor Rutkowska-Tomaszewska to say a few words about it.
Bardzo mocno w
And
sprawach
she's been
organizacyjnych,
supporting
za co
our
już teraz pani
conference,
profesor
and
bardzo serdecznie
she's
dziękuję.
really
A tak jak powiedziałam,
supporting us
panel
in terms of
będzie
organization
szczytu
of
funkcjonowanie
this
pozasądowych metod
conference,
rozwiązywania
and the
sporów na
panel is
rynku
the functioning
finansowym w
out of
Polsce i wybranych
court
krajach Europy.
dispute
Zaczniemy,
resolution of the financial
może
market
gościny,
in
nie?
Poland and in
Polski,
selected
a następnie połączymy się
EU
z
countries. So
naszymi
first we
przyjaciółmi
will
z
start
Włoch, z Irlandii, z Wielkiej Brytanii
here with
i
the
z
Polish speaker, and
Belgii.
later on we will
Tam oni
also
już nas czekają w łączeniu
connect to our friends from
online'owym.
other countries, from
Kto z państwa potrzebował,
Italy,
będzie otrzymał urządzenie do
Belgium,
tłumaczenia. Konferencja będzie
Ireland,
tłumaczona. Pani profesor będzie mówiła po polsku,
and
bo
UK. So
jest
the
nas
conference
więcej tutaj, osób
would be
mówiących po polsku, natomiast państwo prelenci również
translated into
będą mieli
Polish.
zapewnione tłumaczenie na język
So
angielski.
of
Bardzo proszę pani
course
profesor.
there are mostly Polish speakers. So Professor, now the floor is
Dziękuję
yours.
bardzo
Thank you so
za
much.
takie miłe
for
przywitanie.
a very
To wielka
nice,
przyjemność
words of
współpracować z Państwem
welcome.
przy
It's a great
organizacji
pleasure
tej
to
konferencji.
cooperate
Proszę
with you
Państwa,
upon the
rozpoczynamy
organization
zatem
of this
panel,
conference. So we now
który
opening the
mam
panel,
przyjemność moderować.
which
I nie teraz będę
I
mówić,
have the pleasure
bo
to
mój czas
moderate.
dopiero później.
Well,
Natomiast
I will not now be making any
może,
presentation because I
takim
will.
tytułem wprowadzenia
It's planned that I do
chciałam
it
wyraźnie
later,
zaznaczyć,
but as
że
a kind of
no właśnie,
introduction,
mamy
I'd like
poznać,
to clearly
funkcjonowanie
state that we
KDR-ów
are to
innych
get to
krajach
know
i
the
w świetle
functioning of
doświadczeń innych
ADRs in
wybranych
other
krajów.
countries,
I już teraz
and
wypada bardzo
through the
podziękować
experience of
właśnie
other
tym
countries. So
przedstawicielom
we would
innych
like
krajów
very much
europejskich,
to
którzy zechcieli przyjąć
thank
nasze
the
zaproszenie
representatives
i,
of other
wystąpić
countries
w
that
tym,
accepted
w
our
tym
invitation,
panelu.
and that
Myślę, że
would
to
make their presentations in this
bardzo ważny
panel.
jakby
And
element,
I think it's a very
możliwość tego
important
pozasądowego,
element. I mean, the
polubownego
possibility of
rozstrzygania
out of
sporów, myślę ciągle
court
jeszcze
amicable
niedocenianego, rozwijającego się w
resolution
Polsce, ale ciągle jeszcze
of
niedocenianego
disputes,
i nie
and
do
this
końca
element is still
wykorzystane są możliwości,
underestimated
które
in
tkwią
Poland,
w takim
and
właśnie
not
sposobie
all the
rozstrzygania
possibilities
sporów.
of
Myślę
such
także, że to jest dobry,
dispute
dobry
resolutions
czas, żeby
are fully used.
wyraźnie
So I
podkreślić, że jest
think
to,
it's really
ośmielam się
high time
stwierdzić,
that
i użyć takiego
I'd
sformułowania,
like
które
to
właściwie chciałam
say now
później
something
powiedzieć w ramach mojego wystąpienia, że
which I
bardzo
will
ważnym
plan to say it
elementem
later on, but I
kształtowania
would say it now,
społeczeństwa
that a very
takiego
important
obywatelskiego,
element of
społecznej odpowiedzialności
shaping
biznesu,
civic society and
także w kontekście
CSR,
tego, co
also in the
nadchodzi, czyli
context of
uwzględniania
what's
również
coming, that is
konieczności
taking into
raportowania
account
relacji z
the
klientem
reporting
w ramach
of
tego
relations with the
zrównoważonego
customer,
również
under
rozwoju.
also
Ważne jest
sustainable
jakby to,
development.
żeby,
It is
ta
important
skłonność
that this
do takiego
propensity
ADR-owego, tak to
to
nazwę, rozstrzygania sporów,
have
była duża.
ADR
Warto o nią zawalczyć, warto się o nią
dispute
postarać.
resolution
Może
should
czasem i
be
wymusić.
really broad,
To-
and
to
it's
jest
worthwhile to
pewne,
make efforts
pewne takie moje
to have
spostrzeżenie.
it.
Bo jest
So
to mimo
it
wszystko
is an observation of
forma
mine,
też,
because of course
odbudowy zaufania,
form of
zaufania, które
rebuilding
w relacji między
of
instytucjami
trust is
finansowymi
important
a
here. That is
a
the trust
klientami,
between financial
no została
institutions
mimo
and
wszystko
customers,
mocno nadszarpnięta.
because that trust
I
really
parafrazując słowa
has been
Adama Mickiewicza
very
z
much
inwokacji,
disturbed,
no właśnie,
I would say, and I would now quote
zaufanie,
a Polish poet
trzeba
Mickiewicz,
cenić, trzeba
you
odbudowywać
must
i ten się
appreciate
o tym
trust,
dowie, kto
you
je stracił,
must
prawda? Że to nie jest takie
rebuild
łatwe,
it, and
takie
you
łatwe je
know,
odbudować. A myślę, że
you
to
will get to
nastawienie
know it when you lose
właśnie
it.
takie
And it's not easy
mediacyjne
really to recover
do
it, to
rozstrzygania
rebuild it.
sporów,
So I think this
jest sprawą, jak
mediation
powiedziałam, istotną.
uh,
Na początek
in
zatem
dispute resolution
każda
is, as I've already
konferencja
said, a
cenię w
crucial
niej to,
thing.
że
So
można podyskutować, nie tylko wystąpić,
I would say that as regards any conference, it is important
z pewnością będą
that
miały
we
miejsce
can hold the
dzisiaj,
discussions,
ale także
not
ważne jest,
only
żeby
to
o tym
listen to
podyskutować. Więc
presentations,
bardzo
of
bym
course
prosiła
presentations will be made, but it is also
tego
important
panelu,
to
żeby ich
hold the
wystąpienia tak miały
discussions.
po 12 minut. Policzyłam
I'd like panelists
z jakimś
now
może
to ask
drobnym
panelists
przekroczeniem po to, żeby mimo
to
wszystko
make their
wygospodarować
presentations
chociażby te
during
15 minut
12
na
minutes,
dyskusję,
so
na
that we
możliwość
would have
rozmowy,
later on, after their
na
presentation
tematy,
time, for discussions,
które
for
będą w ramach jego
questions
omawiane. Zapraszam zatem panią doktor Jagnę
about
Muchę,
the things discussed. So let me invite first Dr. Jagna
radczynię prawną,
Mucha,
jednocześnie
who
adiunkta
is
w Katedrze
the
Prawa
legal
Europejskiego Wydziału Prawa
advisor, and she
i
works
Administracji Uniwersytetu
for
Warszawskiego,
Warsaw University
by przedstawiła
at
nam
the
niezwykle
European Law
intrygująco
Chair,
brzmiący,
the Law Department.
tytuł,
So she will make a
referat o niezwykle
presentation.
intrygująco brzmiącym tytule od wielkich
The
oczekiwań po
title is
wielkie
really
rozczarowanie.
intriguing of her
Uwagi
speech,
na
from
temat
great
funkcjonowania
expectations
ADR
to
w
great
sporach konsumenckich
disappointment.
w Polsce.
Observations
Zapraszam.
on ADR functioning in consumers' disputes in Poland. The floor is yours. So good morning. I'm happy to welcome you. So once again, my name is Jagna Mucha, a Center for the Research of EU Development, Department of Law, University of Warsaw. Can I say something in English?
This panel among such an excellent speakers who I really admire and whose research has been a great motivation for me for this many years. And here I refer mainly to Professor Stefan Wood, whose research was really, really inspiring for me always and enabled me to reflect on the Polish situation. The title of my presentation is From Great Expectations to Great Disappointment, so it's rather bitter than sweet, but I hope it will trigger some interesting discussions and maybe it will enable us to reflect on how and what should we improve in the future. A teraz przechodząc już na język polski, no właśnie.
So now I'd like to show my presentation. And maybe I'd like to explain the title, which is maybe a bit fatalistic, maybe
Uwagi
not so
na
suitable
rzeczywiście
for
olbrzymie
the title
rozczarowanie,
of this
które
conference.
towarzyszy mi od kilku lat,
gave it because
kiedy to obserwuję rozwój
I've been disappointed for many
i to, w jaki
years
sposób
when
alternatywne
I've
metody
been observing
rozwiązywania sporów
the
konsumenckich funkcjonują
development and the
u nas. I pozwoliłam
functioning
sobie
of
zacząć od przedstawienia tej
ADR
platformy
in Poland.
o której już pani dyrektor
And
wspomniała
first
na
I'd like to
wstępie.
present the ADR
Otóż uważam, że jest
platform, which
to
was mentioned by
rozwiązanie,
director
które
in
mimo tego,
her
że
introduction.
właśnie
I think this
u
is
jego podstaw
the
leżały olbrzymie
solution
oczekiwania i co
and
do
the basis
zasady
of which were really great expectations.
doskonałe,
And
jeżeli chodzi o jego
by definition,
funkcje,
it
tak,
is a
wiele punktów
perfect
kontaktu
mechanism,
dla
a
przedsiębiorców, dla
single
konsumentów,
entry
sposób,
point
w
for
jaki te produkty
businesses,
są kontaktowane
for
z podmiotem
consumers,
ADR.
and how
No,
these entities
rodzi wiele
get into contact with the ADR entity.
wydaje się po prostu doskonałym narzędziem
It
do tego,
seems,
żeby,
as it is arranged,
żeby,
it is a perfect tool
skontaktować, skomunikować,
to
doprowadzić do tego rozwiązania
contact
sporów przez
people
przez te podmioty.
and
Natomiast w
to
praktyce,
have final
z danych Komisji Europejskiej wynika, że
alternative dispute
jednak
resolution.
platforma
However,
ODR nie działa.
from our observations
Przede
in
wszystkim
Europe, we
z uwagi
see
na
that
to, że
ODR platform doesn't work
nigdy nie
because businesses,
w większości przypadków,
businessmen in the
90%
majority of cases, I
zupełnie
mean
nie
90% or
odpowiadają
so,
na wnioski
do
składane
not
przez
reply
konsumentów. I teraz,
to
żeby nie być
the
gołosłownym, proszę
applications
państwa,
lodged by consumers. And
chciałam podać
now
przykład
I'd like
bardzo
to
typowy,
show
skargę
you some
konsumenta,
examples. So that was a
rodziny,
consumer's
która udała
complaint.
się na
That was
wakacje i pilot, miała udać się na
family
wakacje, pilot
that
został
was
odwołany.
to go
Są
on holiday.
świadomymi obywatelami, znają
So
przepisy
they were to take a
prawa
plane, by flight, so
konsumenckiego,
they
wiedzą,
were
że istnieje
aware
rozporządzenie
citizens.
261
They
na 2004,
knew that there is
przysługują odszkodowania z tego
261
tytułu. No i
2004 for regulation, and they contacted Wizz Air, Ryanair, or LOT, I don't know, an airline because it was cancelled. So they did not receive any response. Then they put their application through the platform, and they were waiting for 30 days because according to the guidelines, the dispute should be settled within 30 days. And after 30 days, their case is closed because this Wizz Air, Ryanair, or LOT did not respond to their complaint. So it was a situation like that, that even the participants in the disputes were not contacted with the relevant ADR entity. And in my opinion, that's the weakness of the system. So businesses are not obliged to take part in such proceedings. And as for financial ombudsman, it's different because we have special law providing for that. But as for all other cases, this participation is voluntary. I don't mean whether it should be really binding, whether it's arbitration, facilitation, mediation, or any other method. But what I mean, the businessman should be obliged to take part physically in such procedures. So he must be forced to take part in such procedure, regardless of its outcome. But to ensure the efficiency and effectiveness of the tool, I think that the businessman should be obliged to take part in such procedure. So finally, several words about the platform. So this is a curious situation because on one hand, the regulation on DR imposes the obligation to inform consumers about the existence of that platform, and then the businesses do inform that such a tool does exist, but on the other hand, they are not obliged to take part in such program. And in my opinion, it does not only affect the effectiveness of the procedures, but in my opinion, it even really misleads consumers. And now, as for Polish law, we now have a law on out-of-court dispute settlement, and it implemented the directive. And according to Article 2, the President of the Office for Consumer and Competition Protection keeps the register of ADRs, hence we know which ADRs we have in Poland and which disputes they resolve. So at the moment there are 10 of such entities in Poland. There is the list of them here on the slide. There were 12 of them, and now there are 10. Of course, it's a simplified list because, as you know, there are several such inspection offices in various provinces. But as a rule, we can say that there are 10 different entities. And according to the law, out-of-court disputes should be resolved within 90 days. In especially justified cases, the term could be extended. We have a possibility to resolve these disputes in a binding or non-binding way. So now there are just two entities that resolve it in a binding way. So this is banking arbitration, and the other, the fiscal authority arbitration. Others use other forms of invasion according to Article 31, and this is very interesting, and I'd like to emphasize that the businessman who obliged himself to do that or is obliged to use ADR has specific information obligations. And now going from theory to practice, the legal state, the only entities that resolve disputes via financial ombudsman have the obligation to take part in that program. How do we know how it looks in practice? Because all ADR entities are obliged to submit their reports on their annual activity, and it is provided for in Article 11 in the law on ADR. And I see the weakness of this regulation because ADRs have many obligation information, but there is no one of key importance for consumers. That is specifying how many cases have been resolved to the benefit of the consumer. So for myself as an ordinary citizen, if I look at that report, that would be the most precious information for me. That is, which disputes have been resolved so far and which has been their outcome. So neither the directive nor our law obliges the entities to give such information. Now I'd like to mention 3 ADR entities, which in my opinion
No ich działalność po prostu zasługuje na tutaj chociażby takie skrótowe
are
przedstawienie.
very important and they should be presented. So the first one is the Ombudsman for Passenger Rights and the Civil Aviation Office. I'd like to mention it because now the number of disputes of applications lodged with that Ombudsman is really huge. It's really confidential information, but they also publish it post it on their website, and they are unable really to process all these applications because so many of them are submitted, so they are unable to stick to the deadlines as provided for by the law. So, and over 3,500 applications were sent to them in 2022, and only 800 were settled were processed by ADRs, and only for 20% of them settlements were made, but not as compared to all applications made, but as regards cases referred to ADRs. And what is mostly disappointed is that consumers are waiting for the dispute resolution for over 2 years at the moment because of the fact that the number of applications is so huge and the human resources at this ombudsman are really limited. It's really hard to say anything else but great disappointment, because if I am, as a consumer, to wait for 24 months for dispute resolution by ADR, so I'd rather refer my case in court. Of course, to seek redress in court is another topic, and, well, it's not the right time and place to discuss it. But anyhow, this is not an alternative solution that would ensure efficient, effective resolution of my dispute. And finally, I would mention the banking consumer arbitration, and I know that Madam Arbiter is with us. She will discuss it in more detail. So this is one of the entities financed by the private sector, by banks. They have a transparent report, and this is one of the few entities that publishes such data on the cases to the benefit of consumers, how many to the benefit of the banks, how many settlements were made, and here the outcome is binding for the bank. That's why they publish such data, because in the case of mediations it's difficult to determine whether parties really complied with the judgment or not. So here the average value is about 7,000 Polish zlotys. The time 90 days. So the situation seems well, a model one. And let me emphasize, this is one of the 3 entities financed by businesses, not by the public budget. Another entity I'd like to mention, this is the arbitration court and financial supervision authorities. So the disputes could be resolved through mediation or arbitration, but as regards simplified arbitration procedures, there have been very few of them. Within the recent 3 years, just 3 of them. And most of the cases were settled in mediation procedure, and I must say with some disappointment that this arbitration court does not publish any information how many settlements were signed resulting from mediation. And from the viewpoint of consumers, it seems that this solution should be changed, because, well, for me as a consumer, that would be the most important
rzecznik finansowy.
information.
Też
And
kilka danych i wiem, że
finally,
na temat
this
będziemy
financial
rozmawiać
ombudsman, who is the
później,
host
ale
of
na co
our
chciałam
today's
zwrócić
conference.
uwagę,
I
to
know that
artykuł
we'll discuss
37
it in
ustawy
more
o
detail later, so
rzeczniku
let me
finansowym,
focus on
który
Article
zobowiązuje
37 of the
instytucje
law on financial
finansowe
ombudsman
do
that
tego, aby wzięły
puts
udział
an
w tym
obligation on
postępowaniu pozasądowym, co
financial
jest z mojej perspektywy
institutions to take part in out of
uważam
court
sprawą absolutnie
dispute
kluczową. To jest
resolution,
jedyny taki
and I
podmiot,
think this is
który,
of key importance,
który no
and this is
właśnie
the only
narzuca
entity
udział w
that
tym postępowaniu, tak,
imposes
żeby
participation in
mylić z
such
wiążącym
a
rozstrzygnięciem, po
procedure.
prostu
But
sam
I don't
udział,
mean
bowiem
here the
później postępowanie,
binding
to jest oczywiście
decision
mediacja i,
here,
charakter
because
niewiążący,
participation
tak? Czyli
is
te
later
instytucje finansowe
is
dalej
important,
muszą
and then the
zaakceptować
decision must
zaproponowane
not
rozwiązanie.
will not necessarily be
Jeżeli chodzi o
binding, because
liczbę,
financial
w
institutions have to accept
2022
it.
roku
As for
ponad
figures
1000
of
takich
2022, there were
wniosków
over
trafiło do
1,000 of
rzecznika,
such
ponad
applications
1000 spraw zostało
submitted to the
postępowań
Ombudsman,
zostało
and
wszczętych. I tutaj,
there were
proszę
many
Państwa,
also
no cóż, jedynie 15%
procedures
spraw udało
initiated,
się
but only
zawrzeć
in
ugodę.
15%
No
of
to
them
pozostawiam
the
do Państwa oceny,
settlement
czy to
was
jest
signed.
rozczarowanie,
I
czy
don't
może na
know.
tle tych innych
It's
podmiotów
for you to decide
należałoby uznać
whether
to za
you are
sukces.
disappointed or not, or
Średni czas
against the other
oczekiwania
entities.
sprawy
It's been
125
a
dni, więc
success.
więcej niż
On
przewiduje ustawa, natomiast
waiting for settlement
wydaje mi
was
się,
on
że jeszcze
average
w tych
125 days, so
takie
more
kowalstwo
in the
powinno
previous
zaakceptować.
case, but it is still,
I
let's
kończąc
say,
już
acceptable
zupełnie,
by an average
Dlaczego ja uważam, że to jest takie
citizen.
wielkie rozczarowanie
So,
funkcjonowanie ADR w Polsce? Przede
why
wszystkim
do I
dlatego, że
think
my nie
that
mamy
we have
tej
here disappointment
kultury
as regards the functioning
pozasądowego
of
rozwiązywania
the
sporów,
IDR,
że
because we have no such
przedsiębiorcy,
culture
te instytucje
out of
finansowe
court
przede wszystkim,
dispute settlement,
tutaj jak
and
jesteśmy już w tym obszarze, one nie
various
dostrzegają
institutions,
tego, że
especially
to
financial
jest dla nich
institutions,
szansa,
do
to
not
jest
see
dla nich
that it is a chance for
możliwość
them,
tego, żeby
an
budować
opportunity to
relacje z
build
klientem, żeby budować
relationship
strategię
with the
społeczną,
customer, to build a
odpowiedzialności
social
przedsiębiorcy,
strategy,
żeby po prostu zachęcić do
responsibility
korzystania ze
of
swoich
the
usług, tak? To
business,
wybudować
and to
to swoje
encourage
biznesowe
people
portfolio.
to
I
use
dopóki to się nie
their
zmieni,
services,
to wydaje mi
to
się, że
build their
jakby
business
nie ma
portfolio.
szansy
Unless it
na
changes, there is
poprawę tej
no
sytuacji,
chance to improve the
no bo w obecnym
situation,
stanie prawnym
because at the moment,
przepraszam, zależy
in
od woli
the
tego
current legal
przedsiębiorcy, tak?
situation,
Czy on
everything
będzie
depends
chciał
on
się ugodzić,
the
czy on
will
będzie
of
chciał
the
w ogóle
businessman,
wziąć
whether
udział w
he
tym
would
postępowaniu,
like
czy
to
on w ogóle
make
odpowie
settlement, whether
na
he would
ten
like to
wniosek
take part
konsumenta.
in the procedure, whether
Bardzo
he would
dziękuję.
respond to the consumer's application. Thank you so
Dziękujemy
much.
bardzo i już przystępujemy
so much.
właśnie do wysłuchania wystąpień
now
naszych zagranicznych.
We will
Teraz
have
poproszę panią profesor Marię Cycylię
presentations by our
Paglietти,
foreign
członka
guests. So
zarządu
I'd like to
arbitra bankowego
ask
Włoch,
Maria Cecilia
a jednocześnie
Paglietти,
przedstawiciela
as the
też
member
nauki,
of the
pracownika
banking
Uniwersytetu
arbiter
Roma
in
Tre
Italy, and she also works for the University Roma Tre in
ADR solution
Rome.
operating in Italy and
so the ADR solutions operating in Italy.
obstacles in their operation. With specific references to the arbitro bancario finanziario. Bardzo proszę pani profesor, 15 minut, jeśli się uda szybciej.
So, Professor,
to
the
też
floor is yours. You
będzie
have
bardzo dobrze.
15
Zapraszam.
minutes, and well, you can reduce this time by some minutes if possible. So, the floor is yours.
Yes, and thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Yes, then thank you very much for this kind invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here virtually. So in my 12 minutes, I will be speaking of the Italian ADR systems, which is quite a story of success. In fact, over the past 2 decades, the Italian legal system has been experiencing the spread of idea bodies, especially in regulated markets such as banking, financial, and network services, and based at the supervisory authorities. So, given the title of this conference, I will focus on the two financial ombudsmen operating in Italy. The first one is the Banking and Financial Ombudsman, the Arbitro Bancario Finanziario, which is based at the Bank of Italy
Bancario
and
i
was
Financiario, który ma siedzibę przy
in
Banku
2009.
Włoch,
I
został
have been part of
utworzony w
it for 6 years.
2009
I am
roku. Ja
not
już
an
tam
arbitrator right now.
Działam od paru
And
lat.
also we have another
Mamy również
ombudsman, which
innego
is placed
rzecznika,
by the National Commission and for
który
Companies and the Stock Exchange, the Financial Disputes Ombudsman for
rozpatruje
financial disputes.
finansowe spory. To jest taki
And
rzecznik
it was established
finansowy,
in
który został
2016.
ustawiony w
So I
2016
would like to divide
roku.
my presentation
I
into three
teraz,
parts.
jeśli chodzi o moją
The
prezentację,
first
to
one be related to
będzie
design,
ona
the
podzielona na trzy
second the nature, and the third
części.
one
Pierwsza będzie mówiła o
related to the
zaprojektowaniu,
functions
druga o
of
działaniu, a
ombudsman.
ostatnia o
So the
funkcjach.
design,
Teraz jeśli chodzi o
these ABF and
zaprojektowanie,
ACF
to
share
jeśli
the same
chodzi o
model.
ten
So first of all,
ADR,
they are
przede
they don't have
wszystkim
judicial nature.
y,
So what
działają w
are
model
these
finansowy.
ombudsmen? They are ADR bodies of
Są
the
tutaj te
adjudicative type
organy
because they decide
ADR,
who is right and who
które
is wrong, taking
wydają
into account
orzeczenia,
only the
biorą,
documents submitted
wydają
by the
propozycje, co jest
parties.
słuszne, a co nie, biorąc pod
They
uwagę
are
to, co
based
miały
at the supervisory
do powiedzenia
authorities,
strony.
in respect to which they
One
are autonomous
mieszczą
and impartial,
się
and
w
they
autonomicznych
decide
i
according to the law.
bez,
They do not deprive intermediaries and customers of the power to have recourse to the legal authorities, and they don't require any legal or other professional assistance. And participation in the system is mandatory for the intermediaries authorized to. The forum actoris rule applies, so consumer contract jurisdiction, and they are almost free of charge. So these are the main characteristics of these two ombudsmen. What disputes can these ombudsmen resolve? They hear disputes related to banking and financial transactions and services between customers and intermediaries. They assign to resolve small and medium-sized disputes. So we are out of the logic of the mere small claims because the competence in terms of values ranges from 200,000 euros for the ABF up to 500,000 euros for ACF. Dimensions for some numbers. In 2022, ABF received almost 100,000 complaints. So we have a massive number of complaints. Who can file a complaint? The entitlement is not reserved exclusively to consumers, but also extended to cover collective entities and or natural persons. Decisions are not binding. The sanction in cases of a compliance failure is that the notice of not compliance is published on the website, on the central bank website for 5 years. So there's a blacklist of non-complying intermediaries. The key points are, I think, are the enforceability of decisions, because, as I said, we don't have a binding and enforceable decision, but the effectiveness of protection is ensured through a reputational enforcement mechanism, the so-called shame culture, which in a sector like the banking and financial one that are based on trust and the reliability of the operators is very effective as sanction and deterrent. So these ombudsman's decisions, although not legally binding, are binding at the social level. Plus, if the customer and the intermediary are not satisfied with the ombudsman decision, they may submit their dispute to an ordinary court. As for the model, we could ask ourselves which model, which could have been the model that the legislator had in mind when shaping the characteristics of these ombudsmen. And one interesting thing is that there is no single cultural reference. I think that it's highly likely, highly probable that the Italian legislature could have in mind the model of the English FOS, the Financial Ombudsman Services, based by the Financial Conduct Authority. But again, there's no single cultural reference, and the Italian Ombudsman model is featured by eclecticism. So this is how they work and they have been designed. Now let's have a look to what they are intended to pursue. First of all, as already mentioned, these ombudsmen are not conceived as a tool of consumer protection, because also legal entities are entitled to submit a complaint. Still, they provide a response to the needs to afford protection and restore the balance to asymmetrical positions, also on the procedural level, by the removal of barriers about the effectiveness of protection and the limitation of the time and costs of the procedure. So we may say that these two ombudsmen have a hybrid nature, because they place themselves at the intersection of substantive and procedural law. They are assigned double function. The first one is an immediate function at the micro level, because they settle private disputes. And the second one is a mediated function at the macro level, because they accomplish market regulation. The decisions, although not binding, encourage compliance of conduct among the intermediaries. So these decisions express general principles and wishes and have a high degree of publicity. So the issues here are two: the speed and consistency. Speed, of course, of the decisions, of the outcome of the decision, and has improved by adopting new procedural provisions by the Bank of Italy for the ABF. And now the procedure may last up to 180 days. About the consistency, the issue here is the uniformity of approaches and the stability of the decisions, especially for the ABF, because there are 7 different local panels. So because of this convergence between public enforcement and private remedies, the private disputes becomes instrumental to the public regulation of the market. This implies a significant fallout in terms of the stability of decisions, because given the lack of the principle of stare decisis in our legal system, the uniformity of approach is, in the context of the banking and financial ombudsman, functional on to many different goals. It improves the reliance of operator, is functional to the legal certainty, it's functional to the deflation of internal disputes, to the measurement of regulatory compliance, through the collection and publication of aggregated data on individual disputes, and it's functional to the consolidation of regulation and prospectively to the study of the review of the regulatory framework. So coming to the conclusions, I think we may say that Italian ombudsmen are designed to be instrument of regulation of the contract with the conforming effects. So they are instrumental to public regulation, and this is what has been called regulation through litigation. In order to fully achieve a regulatory effect, the decision must be perceived as stable, and inconsistency and unpredictability of decisions have so many negative effects, because they disorientate the market, because different decisions make it impossible for the banks to identify how they should behave in order to be considered compliant to the system. They cause inconsistency causes the onset of problems relating to decision acceptance, because the consequent risk that those supervised do not abide by the arbitrator's decisions and stand sick ordinary justice. So, in conclusion, we may say that the need for nomophilia to be assured in this sector, because it becomes even more evident in matters subject to a high level of regulatory obsolescence. Consider, for example, payment services where the case law is particularly high, because the delay of the legal format, which is physiological, can only make up for the jurisprudential format. So by meaning that decisions precede legislation. So I think I have been using all my 12 minutes, and I thank you very much for listening.
Myślę, że jeszcze będzie czas w dyskusji też na ewentualne odpowiedzi na pytania. Teraz zapraszam pana profesora Stefana Wuta z Uniwersytetu Lyon i jednocześnie też praktyka, czyli zastępcę sędziego pokoju Brugi, o przedstawienie referatu na temat The Belgian ADR Landscape Status and Future Challenges. Zapraszam, panie profesorze.
Professor, the floor is yours.
Appear on the screen. Do I have to share my screen, or how does this work? Because, oh, there it is. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the very kind invitation to speak at your event. In the slot that was given to me, I will say something about the Belgian ADR landscape with a particular focus on financial ADR, the status and the future challenges. First of all, how do I go to the next slide? I don't know how to do this. Okay, you can go to the next slide also. First of all, the status of the Belgian ADR landscape. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you so much. Okay, so this is how the current ADR landscape looks like in Belgium. First of all, we have a number of ADR entities that are not qualified entities in the sense of the
ADR,
2013
które nie
Consumer
są
ADR Directive.
kwalifikowane
We have
w
to date
znaczeniu
14 ADR entities that are
dyrektywy.
qualified as
I
ADR entities in the
mamy
sense of the
też
Consumer ADR
szereg
Directive.
takich
The
ADR-ów,
directive
które działają
was
zgodnie z dyrektywą
implemented in Belgium in
2013-11,
April
która
2014,
została
and this
przyjęta w
means that
Belgii w
these ADR
2014
entities that are
roku. To oznacza,
qualified
że te
do meet
podmioty
the quality
ADR
requirements of the ADR directive, for
muszą działać
example,
zgodnie z tą
regarding
dyrektywą
impartiality, independence,
europejską, muszą być
etc. So to
niezależne,
date, we
na
have
przykład
14,
i tak dalej.
and the two that are
I
active in
tutaj
the financial
jest
sector are qualified entities. First of all, Ombudsman, which is the ombudsman for the banking sector in the broad sense of the
działają
word,
one
and
w
then the
sektorze
insurance
bankowym, szeroko
ombudsman, which is
rozumianym
the ADR entity
w
for
sektorze bankowym i
insurances.
drugim
And
to jest
thirdly, and
rzecznik
this is what I really would like to talk about a little bit
ubezpieczeniowy.
more, because this is a
I
very
tutaj
peculiar
chciałabym
feature
parę
of
więcej
the
na
Belgian
ten temat
ADR landscape,
powiedzieć, bo to
the
jest bardzo
Consumer
ważna cecha tego
Mediation
krajobrazu ADR-ów.
Service. If you could go to the next slide, please. The Consumer Mediation Service was created in 2014 as the residual ADR entity. In 2014, when the ADR directive had to be implemented in Belgium, the Belgian Minister of Economic Affairs, who really didn't had a lot of ideas about ADR, said we will get rid of all the ombudsmen and we will create one big consumer ombudsman entity. Thank God he didn't do that. But what he did is he looked at the landscape and he saw there were 6 ombudsmen that were the biggest ones, that were very well developed, that had a lot of success. The ombudsman for telecommunication, the ombudsman for energy, the ombudsman for postal services, and the ombudsman for passengers who take the train, the ombuds rail. These are four ombudsmen that are active in the public sector. Next to that, he looked at the private sector, and there was Ombudsman for the banks and for the insurances. And what he said is, I will take those six ombudsmen together and I will put them in the same building. That's the first thing he did. So they are sharing infrastructure, they are sharing the same building, but those six ombudsmen, they form the Consumer Mediation Service, which is the residual ADR entity in Belgium. And that Consumer Mediation Service has three main functions. First of all, their main function is to inform consumers. If a consumer has a question regarding a dispute that he or she has with a company, with a trader, then you can go to the Consumer Mediation Service and then they will inform you. The second function they have is they are a post office. I am a consumer. I have a complaint against, I don't know, a bank, a travel agency, an energy provider, whatever. I go to the website of the Consumer Mediation Service, and the Consumer Mediation Service will send my complaint to the competent ADR entity. Whether that ADR entity is qualified or not is completely irrelevant. So they have a dispatching function, and this works pretty well in the sense that that Consumer Mediation Service has done quite a lot of publicity, quite a lot of marketing, and now in 2023, most Belgian consumers know I have a problem. I don't have to find out which ADR entity is competent. Is it something for the insurance ombudsman? Is it something for the ombudsman? They don't have to worry about that. You go to the website of the Consumer Mediation Service, they will look at your complaint, and then they will send it to the competent ADR entity. Of course, you can still go directly to the competent ADR entity, but this is being done less and less. And finally, the third function of the Consumer Mediation Service is that they are the residual ADR entity. If a consumer makes a complaint against a trader and there is no competent ADR entity, then they will deal with it. The Consumer Mediation Service will deal with that. And on the next slide, if you go again to the next slide, you can see the figures. This is some figures from the annual report of 2022. They received about 14,000 complaints or requests. 27 of them were dispatched to other ADR entities, and about 40% were residual cases, and the Consumer Mediation Service took care of those residual cases themselves. Half of them, a little bit more than half of them, were declared admissible, and the success rate is so. In about 40%, there was a settlement. So, contrary to what Maria Cecilia just explained in Italy, these ombudsmen, also the ones in the financial sector, they do not take a binding decision in the sense that they do not adjudicate the dispute, which in my personal opinion is something that should be done, because I think you really need to have a good system with a triage system, then conciliation, mediation, and then a sort of adjudicative phase. This is not the case in Belgium. The ADR entities, the ombudsman, they try to find an amicable solution between the consumer and the trader. If this is not possible, the only thing they do is they can issue a recommendation. And this is also what happens with the Consumer Mediation Service. In most of these cases, these recommendations are in favor of the consumer. And sometimes the consumer goes to court if, of course, the claim is viable from a cost-benefit analysis, goes to court. And most judges, small claim judges, they follow that recommendation. I am a law professor, but I'm also as a hobby, I am a deputy judge, a substitute justice of the peace, which is a small claims judge. And sometimes, especially in energy cases, because I have competences for all energy disputes, irrespective of the value of the claim, people come to the court with a decision of the, for example, the energy ombudsman, which is very elaborate, which is very legal, and in 95% of the cases, small claim judges will follow that recommendation of the ombudsman. The duration, which is very good because according to the directive, this should be 90 days, is 53 days. So this is quite a good institution. If you go to the next slide, please. There are some challenges ahead, and I would like to mention two. Next slide, please. First of all, something very recent, as you probably know, and I do think that this has been or will be discussed at your conference. The European Commission proposed its proposal or launched its proposal on the 17th of October to amend the ADR directive. We had the honor last year of writing a report for the European Commission in which we give an overview of what was going on in Europe or in a limited number of jurisdictions. And this was used to reflect on the future amendments of the ADR directive. I will be very open, I will be very transparent with you. I did expect more. I think that the proposals that are made could have been a little bit more challenging. I think they put the threshold quite low. The Commission speaks about targeted amendments, which was clear from the beginning. The idea was not to change the complete infrastructure, but to change some issues. The ODR regulation that was already, and the ODR platform that was already mentioned by our colleague from Poland will be repealed, which I think is a pity. They made a lot of investments in that ODR platform, but apparently, and we've seen the numbers, it's not extremely successful. It is today very unclear what will happen with that. And finally, and I do think this is also a little bit strange, but I don't have the time to go into details, a recommendation was issued, so a non-binding recommendation regarding ADR processes on online marketplaces. So Amazon, eBay, things like that. If they have ADR entities, they have to meet or they should meet a number of criteria. And these criteria in that recommendation for online marketplaces was basically copied from the ADR directive. So the ADR directive will, of course, lead to some changes. My prognosis is that mainly in the financial sector and ADR entities that are active in the financial atmosphere will not see a lot of changes. I think most of the changes deal or will have an impact on sectors where ADR is still not very well developed. For example, incentives for traders to participate in ADR, the possibility of bundling ADR claims when the consumer agrees with that. A novelty will be, and I have some problems with that regarding cross-border ADR. They want to create new ADR contact points. So, I mean, I think the idea behind it is very good, but I do think that in my personal opinion, the ambition could have been a little bit higher. This will not be for the current Commission because we have European elections next year. This will be for the next Commission. What the European Commission did not propose and that everybody was waiting for was a new proposal regarding the CPC regulation, the Consumer Protection Cooperation Regulation, but I understood that a consensus was not possible and this was postponed to the next Commission. But this proposal, and you can find the link on the website, will be the debate for the coming months regarding consumer ADR. The second challenge, please, the next slide, is something that I have been working on the last couple of months, the last couple of years. And the outset are two things. First of all, I think it is important to underline, and the global context is basically saying that ADR entities are doing much, much more than only resolving individual disputes. First of all, ADR entities are big data collectors. because most of the consumers make a complaint online. So ADR entities are in a position to detect, to capture structural, systematic problems very quickly. If I am Ombudsman, I am the ADR entity in the financial sector, and in a couple of weeks' time, I receive a lot of similar complaints about the number of consumers regarding the same issue and against the same bank, I can very quickly, in sometimes a couple of days, sometimes a couple of months, sometimes a couple of weeks or months, I can detect a collective structural problem. This is something that courts do not have, or at least courts would see those systematic problems much, much later. Secondly, there is a tendency in Europe, especially in sectors that are heavily regulated, for example, in the financial sector, where you also have regulators, for example, the Banca d'Italia in Italy, the Ministry of Economic Affairs in Belgium, they are regulators. If companies do something wrong, they will do an investigation, and if the company really did something wrong, they will take a big stick and they will hit the company on the head with a stick, aka they will impose a fine. What we have seen in the last years is that a lot of ADR, well established, good functioning ADR entities, also seem to have a regulatory function. This is laid down in the directive. Article 17 of the current directive states that there should be an exchange of information between ADR entities and regulators. My proposal was to make that article a little bit more robust. Unfortunately, they didn't do that. But this is something that is important. For example, also, I'm an objective, or I am an independent member of the board of directors of Ombudsman. If I see and hear what the ombudsman is telling us, in a lot of cases, he's in touch with the regulator, especially when he sees a structural problem. I hear the same story of the energy ombudsman, who sometimes picks up his phone and says, look, regulator, there is a problem with that company. So this is that regulatory function of ADR entities, which is important. But in Belgium, and this is my last point that I want to make, a bit of a critical point, is that the current Belgian government doesn't like the fact that ADR entities are data collectors, and they don't like the fact that ADR entities are having a regulatory function. I think they are wrong. What the government in Belgium now wants to do, and this is currently a very big ongoing fight, is they want to create their own platform called Consumer Connect. What they want to do is they want to take away from all of these qualified ADR entities, Ombudsman, the Consumer Mediation Service, the beginning of the ADR process. If a consumer has a complaint, the government says, you don't have to go to these ADR entities anymore. You have to use our platform, and then we will dispatch it to the competent ADR entities. There is no added value of that, but the reason why the government wants to do that is they want to have the data that the ADR entities are collecting. They want to see in real time what the problems on the market are. And this is the reason why they want to take that away. This, I mean, in my personal opinion, this can create a lot of problems regarding impartiality, regarding trust. We will see now what will happen. The proposal was submitted to Parliament. There will be quite an interesting debate. But this shows, for me, that ADR entities in Belgium work very well, and that they have a function that is much more than simply resolving individual complaints. They have a regulatory function, and they collect a lot of data. So I think from a comparative law perspective, for other colleagues in Europe, I think this could be interesting. This, I think I spoke already too long, so thank you very much for your attention. And if you would have any questions, I am very happy to answer them. Thank you very much.
Dziękujemy bardzo, panie profesorze, za niezwykle pasjonujące wystąpienie. Myślę, że będzie, mam nadzieję, taki jeszcze czas na dyskusję. A teraz bardzo proszę już Kolejni nasi prelegenci to przedstawiciele już praktyki, przedstawiciele odpowiednich rzeczników w Wielkiej Brytanii i w Irlandii. Najpierw bardzo proszę o to, by swój referat wygłosiła pani Mary Rose McGovern, właśnie przedstawicielka Deputy Financial Services and Pensions Ombudsman z Irlandii na temat Alternative Dispute Resolution of Financial Services Service Compliance in Ireland. Bardzo proszę. Bardzo przepraszamy, nie słyszymy niestety, nie słyszę niestety pani.
Thank you very much, everybody. Apologies, I didn't have my microphone on there. Thank you very much to my colleagues in Poland for inviting me here today to speak to you. I was very struck by Dr. Jagna's comment about great expectations and potentially great disappointment. I'd really like to think that for the FSPO in Ireland, and I think there are great expectations on this organisation because we have very considerable powers when investigating financial service complaints, but I'd really like to think that overall it has not been a great disappointment because we very often annually and sometimes biannually are in a position to demonstrate the very positive outcomes that we can achieve when we investigate financial service complaints. So looking at this slide here, it's important to stress that this organisation is based in legislation. It's a statutory scheme. It has been a statutory scheme since 2005, when the Insurance Ombudsman and the Banking Ombudsman merged into one entity. And then in 2018, the FSPO came into being, and that's the current iteration. And that also includes the power to investigate pension scheme complaints. The fact that it's a statutory scheme presents its own challenges, and I know there's been reference this morning to the proposals for the amendment of the ADR directive, and from the FSPO's point of view, the idea that you might take upon yourself the jurisdiction to investigate complaints about the conduct of financial service providers that are not regulated in the EEA is certainly potentially problematic for an organisation such as ours, where the powers are based in legislation and specifically call out what we have jurisdiction over and what we don't. So the next slides, please. So this statutory scheme sets out that the Ombudsman can investigate complaints from consumers about the conduct of regulated financial service providers and pension providers. The powers, as I mentioned, are quite strong. Compensation can be directed up to €500,000, and rectification can be directed, and that is of unlimited value. And I will tell you about some examples in a minute. The decisions are legally binding, which of course brings finality because they are binding unless they're appealed to the High Court. We publish all of our decisions in order to ensure that the information is made available to the public about the perspective that the FSPO takes when investigating financial service complaints. The service is free to consumers because the majority of our funding comes from a levy on the industry. So the next slide, please. The definition of consumer, so who can bring a complaint to the FSPO. So it includes not only a natural person who isn't acting in the course of business, but it also includes those businesses, sole traders, partnerships, corporate entities or charities, any entity that has a turnover of 3 million or less. And we know from our research that in Ireland, that includes approximately 91 or 92% of organisations that do business in Ireland, because they are falling already within the definition of a micro enterprise. So the next slide, please. This slide talks, the next slide, please. So this slide sets out the mission of the office. And I want to say something there about our vision, which is a progressive financial services and pensions environment built on trust, fairness and transparency. And those last words there are really important, where complaints are the exception. And the reason why those words are included is because we take a very strong view that the success of this organization is not measured by the FSPO investigating more and more and more complaints, but it's more about an organisation that is supported by these strategic goals that are set out there on the slide, where we connect and engage with members of the public so they know where to come if they have a problem, where we evolve to meet their needs. And this idea of sharing and influence, that's a really important component to how we achieve success. There was talk earlier about potentially systemic problems and being able to refer them to the regulator, and there is a power in our governing legislation. So when we investigate a complaint, we can make a formal referral to the Central Bank of Ireland as the regulator, and it can pick matters up from there if we think that the issue is potentially systemic. But we believe that if we share our perspectives and we continue to influence how financial service providers go about delivering their services, this should contribute to the reduction of complaints rather than a drive for this organisation to do more and more. And that's really where the real value is. So the next slide, please. I wanted to mention the FSPO values because they're really the cornerstone on which the service is built. And, you know, when you hear about Ombudsman, you hear all sorts of things about fairness and impartiality and independence. And, I'm really satisfied that our values are suitable to underpin how we go about our work on a day-to-day basis. The effectiveness is really where we struggle, and harpening back to those discussions about having limited resources. And I'm sure that most organisations, like the organisations in Ireland, are continuing to struggle with recruitment and retention of staff. There's a lot of movement in the labour force, and that's where the effectiveness is one of the challenges that we currently face. So the next slide, please. I wanted to show you where our complaints come from, and this is the map of where we received our complaints from in 2022. So we received 4,781 complaints, and the vast majority of those come from the Republic of Ireland or Northern Ireland. But outside of that, there were almost 900 complaints that came from Europe and indeed the rest of the world. And this is where the developments and proposals for revision of the ADR directive are potentially very important to the FSPO, because where we see cross-border complaints, it can be problematic for the FSPO to investigate the complaint if the governing law is the law of another country. So the FSPO made a submission to the Commission about the issue of the governing law, because we believe that offering a consumer the choice between their local law and the governing law of the contract would be a good development in the evolution of the ADR directive. So we're keeping an eye on that. So the next slide, please. In 2022, this illustrates where we received our complaints from, and about 55% are coming from banking, 24% from insurance, and then the smaller elements of investment and pension schemes. And if you could move to the next slide, please. I've given you a breakdown there that you can look at your leisure if you're interested in those sectors. As you can well expect, banking complaints largely concern accounts and mortgage agreements. On the insurance side, the complaints are largely driven by motor, and the next biggest segment is really driven by private health insurance complaints, with then a kind of a healthy mix of travel and home insurance and life assurance. The pension scheme complaints on the bottom right are only concern occupational pension schemes, whereas if you look at the left, there is a reference to pension, but those are private pension investments, as it were, and they fit into the sector for investments. So the next slide, please. Section 12 of the governing legislation sets out what is meant by investigating and what the expectations are of the Ombudsman when dealing with complaints. And you'll see there that Section 12 talks about informal means and also talks about mediation and formal investigation, including oral hearings. So in 2022, when we closed 4,647 complaints, the 2,090 on the blue part of that funnel shows complaints where we resolved them very early in the journey of the complaint, where they came to our front door, they were welcomed into our office, and even the initial engagement with the financial service provider led to a resolution of the complaint. When we receive a complete complaint, and that's our complaint form and the final response letter from the financial service provider, we swiftly move that complaint into our dispute resolution service, which is there in green. And that's where we undertake our mediation process and where we assist the parties to design their own resolution so that we don't have to move to an imposed resolution, which is what happens in the formal investigation process. So adding together the blue and the green there, 82% of our complaints in 2022 were resolved on that voluntary basis without an outcome being imposed. The typical timeline for a mediation is about 12 weeks. So jumping in there early, helping the parties quite early in the process to think about how they want to resolve it, that really brings home the benefits. The formal investigation process is a much longer process. Typically, it takes 9 to 18 months to move through that process once it begins. And we see that that's beginning to stretch into about 24 months because of that issue of retention of staff. And, this is something that we're keeping an eye on in terms of our own internal resourcing. But that formal investigation process involves the gathering of items of evidence and occasionally an oral hearing. We do about 10 oral hearings a year typically, and that leads to a decision which is legally binding. As I mentioned, we publish our legally binding decisions in an anonymized fashion. And right now on our website, there are more than 2,200 decisions that you can search. You can slice it and dice it by choosing upheld, not upheld, the sector, the product, to see what you're looking for. So the next slide, please. In terms of the outcomes for those 4,647 complainants in 2022, on the left-hand side, those 1722 complaints that were successfully mediated led to outcomes which amounted to 3.4 million. When Dr. Yagna was speaking earlier, I know that there was a much larger sum of money mentioned, but of course you have to bear in mind that the population of Ireland is about 5 million as opposed to Poland, which is something like 38. So the numbers are always going to be smaller. We also achieve settlements even at the beginning of the formal investigation process. And you'll see in the second tower there that some of those settlements in the investigation services led to outcomes that were worth almost €1 million. And then those complaints where a legally binding decision was issued, there was another 616,000 that was directed by way of compensation. And there was another almost 200,000 that was available without the need for a direction to be made. If you just go back to the previous slide, I want to mention the rectification, because the power of the Ombudsman can direct the restoration of a policy of insurance, which is sometimes more valuable than compensation, or the fixing of a credit rating, or the writing off of a loan balance, that sort of thing. This slide here that you're looking at shows what the challenge is for this organisation right now, and that is the trend in the upsurge of complaints. And you'll see there that on the banking side, the percentage increase measuring from June 21 to 22 and comparing it with June 22 to 2023 is at 30%. And again, this is something that we'd like to see go in the other direction. So the next slide, please. On the banking side, we're keeping a close eye on the percentage of complaints that we're receiving. So when this organisation opened its doors in January 2018, it was about 50% of our complaints were represented by banking complaints, but you'll see that towards the end of 2021, the beginning of 2022, that had climbed to 63%, and it's on a trajectory to get to 60% by the end of this year. The next slide, please. When we look behind that data, we see that over the same period of time, the percentage share of complaints about disputed transactions has grown incredibly from 12% at the beginning of 2018 to 32% in early 2023. Next slide, please. By way of comparison, on the insurance side, there hasn't been that much of a change. The percentage has stayed more or less the same. Sorry, the next slide, please. When we break down the insurance, we see a huge increase in the number of complaints being received from the issue of claim handling, whereas in comparison, the number of complaints that have been received concerning the suggested mis-selling of an insurance product has completely fallen from what once was about 10 or 15%, and over the last couple of years it's been represented by about 2% of complaints. I don't know if my slides are stuck there, but if I could move on about 3 slides. And another one. And one more. And one more again. So just to finish on what the challenges are for this organisation, because it's a statutory scheme and we have to stick strictly to the rules, we do face periodic challenges to the legally binding decisions that we issue by way of a statutory appeal to the High Court, or if we make a determination on jurisdiction. For example, if we suggest that a complaint hasn't been received on time, that's capable of being judicially reviewed to the court. And we have 9 such ongoing matters at the moment, and the list is available on our website. We make that public. And the next slide, please. Happily, the trajectory of challenges to decisions and determinations made by this office has reached a peak in 2021, and over the last couple of years it has considerably fallen, and in fact we've only received 2 this year. And the next slide, please. If you go to the website, you will see that we publish an overview of complaints by the end of March every year. So next March, we will be publishing our overview, and it will share data relating to the complaints that we received and how we dealt with them and what they were about and what the outcomes were during 2023. And the next slide, please. One other item that I'd like to draw your attention to is the digest of decisions that we publish. So periodically we adopt a theme. So volume 3 there was our decisions on tracker mortgage complaints, and then volume 7 and 8 there that we published last concerned decisions that we issued on travel insurance and also on health insurance, and they are a permanent resource on our website, so that we encourage members of the public to go in there and have a look at those decisions and see what they think in terms of what their own complaint might be about. So thank you very much. My last slide there, just ask for any questions and I will be happy to deal with them at an appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary Rose. I ostatni nasz prelegent, też przedstawiciel ombudsmana, pan Richard West, Director of Casework Policy, Financial Ombudsman Service, referat na temat out of court dispute resolution and the experience of the UK's Financial Ombudsman Service. Please.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today about the experiences and work of the United Kingdom's Financial Ombudsman Service. Much like the previous speakers, I plan to tell you a little bit about our background, powers, and the regulatory environment in which we work, before going on to talk about some of the features of the scheme and the wider environment which have led to the Ombudsman Service becoming an attractive and effective out-of-court dispute resolution service, handling hundreds of thousands of individual cases each year. So to start with some background, the Financial Ombudsman Service was established by an Act of the UK Parliament in 2000 to provide an independent alternative to the courts and to help resolve individual complaints between businesses providing financial services and their customers quickly and with the minimum formality, deciding cases on the basis of what the Ombudsman considers to be fair and reasonable in all the circumstances of the case. 8 existing largely voluntary schemes excuse me, and their staff from the banking, investment and insurance sectors were brought together to form a single statutory scheme paid for by financial services businesses, providing comprehensive coverage over regulated financial services businesses and their activities. Consumers must usually first complain to the financial business to allow it a chance to respond and to sort things out. But if the business is unable to resolve the complaint, the consumer may refer it to the Ombudsman Service, where the complaint will in the first instance be reviewed by an investigator who will give the parties an indication of the likely outcome and seek to resolve the complaint informally by the agreement of both parties. Currently, around 82% of the complaints referred to us are resolved this way. But if resolution through informal means is not possible, the complaint will be considered afresh by an ombudsman, of which we have around 400, who will issue a formal final determination setting out their conclusions and any award and their reasons for coming to their final view. When doing so, our aim is to ensure compensation is paid where it is due, but if it is not, that consumers understand why that is the case, so that they can move on and put things behind them. Consumers do not have to accept the decisions we make. They are always free to reject the decision and go to court instead, if that is available. But if a consumer accepts an ombudsman's decision, it is binding on both parties. And should the business not pay, the consumer can enforce the ombudsman's decision through the courts as if it were a court judgment, although that is only very rarely required. Ombudsman's decisions are final, and there is no further right of appeal. But as a statutory decision-making body, our decisions are subject to the possibility of judicial review on limited public law grounds, broadly illegality, irrationality and procedural impropriety. The limited basis for seeking judicial review means that such challenges are rare and rarely successful. So in effect, the Ombudsman word is final, and that brings finality to the parties. We can consider complaints about a wide range of financial matters, from insurance and mortgages to investments and pensions, bank accounts and payment fraud. And because UK law deems credit providers responsible for the acts and omissions of the suppliers of goods and services financed by credit in some circumstances, we also handle several thousand complaints each year about the sale and quality of goods and services, including complaints about timeshares, faulty cars, poorly fitted kitchens, and cancelled flights. Last year, we resolved around 209,000 complaints, upholding and making awards in around 35% of them, although there's considerable variation in uphold rates depending on the complaint type and sectoral area. There are, of course, many drivers of complaint volumes to the Ombudsman Service, including business behaviour and how those businesses respond to complaints when they are made, evolving perceptions of fairness and expectations of good service, and in the UK, the presence of professional representatives actively looking for areas of potential consumer detriment that might give rise to high volume complaints. But the volume of complaints consistently referred to the Ombudsman Service suggests that the service is an attractive and widely recognised out-of-court dispute resolution option for financial services-based complaints in the UK. In my view, there are a number of factors which have helped to make that so. The fact we are free to consumers is of course fundamental. But after that, I think the comprehensive coverage provided by the Ombudsman Service across the financial sector is also very important. Consumers can and will only access alternative dispute resolution providers if they know about them and where to find them. The ADR directive compelled member states to make ADR processes available and to require traders to tell consumers about their ADR entity and whether they were prepared to use that entity. But ultimately, as we heard earlier, the decision as to whether to use the entity is the traders to make. And speaking now as a consumer rather than as an ombudsman, the impression I get is that there is also little awareness in the UK of the requirement amongst traders after the rules were introduced, and so the impact of the ADR directive was limited in its general application and in its promotion of out-of-court dispute resolution. But in contrast, in the financial services sector, there's been compulsory ombudsman coverage since December 2001 and strict regulatory requirements for financial businesses to treat any expression of dissatisfaction alleging financial loss as a complaint, to respond to that complaint within specified time limits, usually 8 weeks, but sometimes less, and to provide a final response letter explaining whether the complaint is upheld or not, and the reasons for that decision. And they must tell the consumer about the availability of the Financial Ombudsman Service, and importantly, of the consumer's right to refer the complaint to the Ombudsman. Businesses are also required in every case to provide information about the Ombudsman Service, including a leaflet produced by us, which explains our role and informal nature and processes, so consumers are not put off by any misconceptions they may have about what might lie ahead. In addition, our jurisdiction is broad, and we can consider complaints from a wide range of customers, including consumers, micro-enterprise and small businesses, charities with an income of less than £6.5 million, and trusts valued at less than £5 million. The compulsory and broad nature of our jurisdiction means that in any case, whether a low-value complaint about the impact of poor customer service or a high-value claim that a consumer may be considering taking to court, the business must tell the consumer that they have the option of using our free independent service, irrespective of the size or complexity of the complaint, or whether the consumer has already indicated their intent to pursue the court route. The basis on which we are required to consider complaints, backed by our significant award-making powers, also serves to reinforce the attractiveness of the Ombudsman option for consumers. We're required to decide complaints on the basis of what the Ombudsman considers to be fair and reasonable in all the circumstances, taking into account relevant law, regulatory rules and guidance, and relevant industry codes, and also what the Ombudsman considers to have been good practice. But whilst we're required to take into account the law, we are not compelled to follow it. And that broad test, based ultimately on what is fair, coupled with the informal nature of our processes and the Ombudsman's inquisitorial remit, which means consumers don't need to think of or put forward every argument that might be relevant to their case, means that the Ombudsman is an attractive and popular option. In addition, our award limit, which currently stands at £415,000 and which increases with inflation year on year, and at the other end of the spectrum, our ability to award compensation for non-financial loss, particularly for any distress or inconvenience suffered by the complainant as a result of the financial business's actions, mean we're a viable alternative to courts, not just for low-value complaints, but also for high-value complaints and for complaints where the consumer might never consider going to court because, for example, a remedy for non-financial loss might not be available or worth pursuing. But of course, dealing with such a wide variety of complaints comes with many challenges, particularly in seeking to resolve high-value, highly complex complaints at pace, or in resolving mass complaints submitted in high volumes. We are, however, supported and able to work very closely, and this is very important, with the UK's financial services regulator, the Financial Conduct Authority, particularly around significant issues with wider implications for the financial services sector. And this relationship is another important factor in establishing the credibility and effectiveness of the Financial Ombudsman Service. The FCA, the regulator, and we have a legal duty to cooperate with each other and to share information which helps to support the delivery of our respective statutory functions. In practice, among other things, this means the regulator is there to ensure financial service firms comply with our complaint handling rules, cooperate with our investigations, and implement the learnings from our decisions. The regulator can also impose compulsory redress where there is widespread consumer detriment, and it will take into account the intelligence and the data shared by the Ombudsman Service when deciding whether to do so. And so for firms, this means our decisions can have a significant impact on both their everyday business activities and in their response to complaints. Linked to this, we recognise we can and should fulfil a wider role than the courts In addition to deciding individual cases, we can also proactively feed back and share the lessons from our work to help governments, regulators, businesses and consumers improve things for the future. In doing so, this can help reduce future complaints and build the credibility and awareness of the service's core complaint handling function. In practice, we do it in a number of ways. We regularly publish data on our website, both about the issues we're seeing and the businesses we're receiving the most complaints about. We share information about our approach to cases, including guidance notes and case studies on our website and through our engagement, so both consumers and businesses know what good looks like and issues can be resolved early on. And we publish all our Ombudsman final decisions to provide transparency about our work and findings. We actively engage with key stakeholders across the sector, with individual business, trade bodies and consumer groups, as well as the regulators and politicians. And through our engagement, we share what we see, what's going well and what isn't, and hope to drive better behaviour. And where necessary, we use our powers to refer issues to the regulator to take supervisory action, particularly where those issues are widespread. It's also important we think that consumers know about their options when they have financial problems. As I've already explained, the key way consumers find out about us is through the financial business themselves. This ensures anybody who already knows they've got an issue can find out about us at the key moment. But not all consumers will know where to start when they have a problem, and so would never get to hear about us, which is why we also invest in reaching consumers directly. And we do that in a number of ways. Our website performs well in online searches for keywords and issues that people with a financial problem may be searching for. And this is something we regularly review and invest time in, and we know it's successful in posting people to us. In fact, we received about 7,000 unique engaged sessions on the website every day. That's around 2.5 million a year, where users have stayed and moved around the website looking for information. We also have presence on key social media sites and target our content to the audiences of those sites. And we regularly receive complaints referred to us through social media sites, particularly through Facebook. And we work closely with consumer groups that we know are working with the most vulnerable consumers. And we focus on maintaining a presence in mainstream and targeted media, working with journalists on key information pieces. And we work with trusted spokespeople in the UK to share our messages, which also helps to build trust in our service. The awareness of our service is one of our key service standards that we hold ourselves accountable to. We measure awareness through an external agency who survey over 2,000 people each quarter, and around 50% of the UK population can currently identify the Financial Ombudsman Service as the organisation that can help it when faced with a financial problem. Compared to similar organisations, that's a very positive figure. And of course, we want to ensure that we are accessible to all consumers. So we offer, as a matter of course, a range of common adjustments and bespoke services to help ensure we can meet the needs of our potential consumer base, ensuring access for all. I'll leave it there, very conscious of time, but just to say thank you very much again to our hosts for giving us the opportunity to speak, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. Proszę Państwa, mimo że jesteśmy trochę przekroczeni w czasie, mam przyzwolenie o przedłużenie o 5 minut jedynie, więc jeśli są jakieś głosy, chcielibyście Państwo zadać pytanie naszym prelegentom, to zapraszam. Trzeba podejść tutaj, żeby, tak, do mównicy. Nie trzeba, jest mikrofon, można, tak? To bardzo proszę, czy Państwa coś zaintrygowało? To bardzo proszę, Pani doktor Mucha.
Dr. Mucha, please. Nie słyszę. Nie słyszę. Nie słychać.
Over 20,000 complaints. Do you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah? That there are over 20,000 complaints a year, and if the trader does not complain, you put him on this internet website, and it's, well, the resolution is not legally binding, but you said that it's socially binding. So I'm very curious about the numbers. So how many this shame schemes do you publish on your websites, and how many traders do not follow your resolution? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your question. Yes, so almost all the intermediaries are complying to our decisions. We have a percentage of 19.9 of compliance because the shame culture works very well. The name of the intermediary is not which don't accomplish our decisions are published on the ABF website and also on the Bank of Italy website for 5 years. This means that intermediaries are not interested in having their name in this blacklist, which has a very persuasive force. So, as you recall, it's not. Of course, it's not legally binding, but it has a very deep and very strong effect on the social level. So we have almost 10% of the intermediaries accomplished our decisions.
A czy nie było procesów odszkodowawczych?
Didn't you
Czy ci
have
przedsiębiorcy, którzy
any
znaleźli się na tej
trials
czarnej
for
liście,
damages
czy to wynika z Państwa
by
regulacji, że macie możliwość
those
prawa
entrepreneurs, by
powszechnie
businesses that are on
obowiązującego
the black
zamieszczać takie
list?
czarne listy
This is
i czy
because
nie
your
zdarzyły się
binding
procesy
law is
właśnie
such that you
za
can put
naruszenie
them on
dóbr
the
osobistych?
blacklist. I mean, did they not sue you for putting them on the blacklist? Because that was the loss of their reputation.
No, they can't because the participation to the system is obliged. As you mentioned in your previous speech, this is a key point. Because they have there's a adhesion to the system is compulsory, so they just accept all the consequences of this adhesion, so they cannot make anything on the legal level about their reputation. Of course, they can go to the court if they don't like the outcome of the decision, but this is established in the provision that in the rules of the ABF procedure, so they can't do anything about it.
Dziękuję bardzo. Thank you very much. Ja jeszcze mam pytanie, jeśli można, do pani
I have a
Mary Rose
question, if
McGovern.
possible, to Mary
Powiedziała
Rose
pani o
McGovern.
publikacji
You said
decyzji
about the
rzecznika.
publication of the
Czy to
decisions
jest
of
publikacja wszystkich
the
decyzji, które
Ombudsman? Do you
zapadają, czy
publish
tylko
all the
niektórych
decisions that
wybranych,
are
jakichś
made, or
strategicznych?
just some
Czy to
selected of
jest
them
jednak
strategic
taka
decisions,
tendencja, która,
or is it
no można ją
a
też
tendency
zaobserwować, że
that
pewne
you can
orzeczenia się
observe
publikuje,
that
na przykład
some
decyzje u nas
adjudications are
w
published,
Polsce
like for
prezesa
example,
Urzędu
we
Ochrony
publish in
Konkurencji i
Poland
Konsumentów
decisions
też są
of the President
dostępne
for the
dla
Protection of
wszystkich. Czy
Consumers and
to jest
Competition.
tutaj
They are
też taka
accessible to
praktyka u
everyone.
Państwa?
So is that a common practice in your country?
So we are permitted to publish all of the decisions, and we try to publish all of the decisions, but we have to publish them in a way that respects the confidentiality and the privacy of the complainant in particular. And the legislation says that they can't be identified by name, address, or otherwise. And the otherwise presents a sort of a challenge if the circumstances leading to the complaint, for example, were to involve a very unusual event that may have been the subject of reports in the media. So if somebody died in certain circumstances and there was a complaint arising out of a life assurance policy, it becomes difficult to publish the decision without having some detail in there that would make them identifiable maybe not to everybody, but would make them identifiable to a small, perhaps, number of people. So we have an individual team that only works on reading those decisions with fresh eyes to make sure that people aren't identifiable. And when we put them through that additional test, even though there are minor redactions applied, we find that typically about 3% of complaints involve a very unusual disease or something that would make the complainant identifiable. So having looked at it very recently, it's about 97% of our financial service decisions that are published and available to everybody.
Dziękuję bardzo. Czy jeszcze? Już. Proszę Państwa, zatem już czas nas goni. Jestem zmuszona zamknąć ten panel. Bardzo dziękuję wszystkim prelegentom przede wszystkim za niezwykle pasjonujące, interesujące wystąpienia. Myślę, że będą one stanowiły świetny punkt wyjścia do naszych dalszych dyskusji w dniu dzisiejszym, szczególnie właśnie te doświadczenia także przedstawione przez praktyków.
Point for further
Nie wiem, chcę się
discussions during
powiedzieć,
our
że
conference, especially experiences presented by practitioners. But let me end with a question, Mark. Does it mean that the binding nature of ADR entities or ADRs is something that we should implement in Poland? And maybe this would be an effective way of resolving disputes. I mean, well, this binding nature is important, although it gives rise to many controversies, especially taking into account Polish law and Polish system of justice. And now we will have a 10 minutes break.
Experiences and thoughts about the ADR system. I think there's a lot of challenges lying ahead us. Thank you once again. Drodzy Państwo, bardzo dziękuję. Teraz oczywiście przerwa 10 minut. Powiedzmy, że spotkamy się o godzinie 11:40, natomiast bardzo ważne ogłoszenie. Proszę tych Państwa, którzy użyli słuchawek do tłumaczenia, aby teraz wychodząc, jest tutaj dwóch moich bardzo sympatycznych kolegów, którzy będą je od Państwa odbierać, ponieważ jest to dróg ścisłego zarachowania. Bardzo dziękuję, zapraszam na kawę.
Rzecznik finansowy jest niezależną instytucją. Pomagamy poprzez bezpłatne porady, interwencje oraz pomoc w procesach sądowych osobom będącym w sporach z bankami i firmami ubezpieczeniowymi. Naszym kapitałem jest zaangażowany zespół wykwalifikowanych prawników. Na nasz wniosek Sąd Najwyższy rozstrzyga w wątpliwych sprawach, często na korzyść konsumenta. Rzecznik Generalny TSUE przychylił się do stanowiska rzecznika finansowego w głośnej sprawie kredytów frankowych. Wspieramy obywateli, prowadząc szybkie i tanie postępowania ugodowe. Stanowią one alternatywę dla długotrwałych i kosztownych postępowań sądowych. Aktywnie uczestniczymy w tworzeniu prawa tak, aby przepisy jak najlepiej chroniły interesy klientów instytucji finansowych. Podczas spotkań zdalnych i stacjonarnych z mieszkańcami w całej Polsce uczymy rozwagi finansowej i ostrzegamy przed zagrożeniami. Kształcimy studentów w zakresie prawnej ochrony konsumentów. W tym celu tworzymy Akademię Rzecznika Finansowego. Codziennie stoimy na straży Waszych finansów. Rzecznik finansowy jest niezależną instytucją. Pomagamy poprzez bezpłatne porady, interwencje oraz pomoc w procesach sądowych osobom będącym w sporach z bankami i firmami ubezpieczeniowymi. Naszym kapitałem jest zaangażowany zespół wykwalifikowanych prawników. Na nasz wniosek Sąd Najwyższy rozstrzyga w wątpliwych sprawach, często na korzyść konsumenta. Rzecznik Generalny TSUE przychylił się do stanowiska rzecznika finansowego w głośnej sprawie kredytów frankowych. Wspieramy obywateli, prowadząc szybkie i tanie postępowania ugodowe. Stanowią one alternatywę dla długotrwałych i kosztownych postępowań sądowych. Aktywnie uczestniczymy w tworzeniu prawa tak, aby przepisy jak najlepiej chroniły interesy klientów instytucji finansowych. Podczas spotkań zdalnych i stacjonarnych z mieszkańcami w całej Polsce uczymy rozwagi finansowej i ostrzegamy przed zagrożeniami. Kształcimy studentów w zakresie prawnej ochrony konsumentów. W tym celu tworzymy Akademię Rzecznika Finansowego. Codziennie stoimy na straży Waszych finansów. Rzecznik finansowy jest niezależną instytucją. Pomagamy poprzez bezpłatne porady, interwencje oraz pomoc w procesach sądowych osobom będącym w sporach z bankami i firmami ubezpieczeniowymi. Naszym kapitałem jest zaangażowany zespół wykwalifikowanych prawników. Na nasz wniosek Sąd Najwyższy rozstrzyga w wątpliwych sprawach, często na korzyść konsumenta. Rzecznik Generalny TSUE przychylił się do stanowiska rzecznika finansowego w głośnej sprawie kredytów frankowych. Wspieramy obywateli, prowadząc szybkie i tanie postępowania ugodowe. Stanowią one alternatywę dla długotrwałych i kosztownych postępowań sądowych. Aktywnie uczestniczymy w tworzeniu prawa tak, aby przepisy jak najlepiej chroniły interesy klientów instytucji finansowych. Podczas spotkań zdalnych i stacjonarnych z mieszkańcami w całej Polsce uczymy rozwagi finansowej i ostrzegamy przed zagrożeniami. Kształcimy studentów w zakresie prawnej ochrony konsumentów. W tym celu tworzymy Akademię Rzecznika Finansowego. Codziennie stoimy na straży Waszych finansów. Rzecznik finansowy jest niezależną instytucją. Pomagamy poprzez bezpłatne porady, interwencje oraz pomoc w procesach sądowych osobom będącym w sporach z bankami i firmami ubezpieczeniowymi. Naszym kapitałem jest zaangażowany zespół wykwalifikowanych prawników. Na nasz wniosek Sąd Najwyższy rozstrzyga w wątpliwych sprawach, często na korzyść konsumenta. Rzecznik Generalny TSUE przychylił się do stanowiska rzecznika finansowego w głośnej sprawie kredytów frankowych. Wspieramy obywateli, prowadząc szybkie i tanie postępowania ugodowe. Stanowią one alternatywę dla długotrwałych i kosztownych postępowań sądowych. Aktywnie uczestniczymy w tworzeniu prawa tak, aby przepisy jak najlepiej chroniły interesy klientów instytucji finansowych. Podczas spotkań zdalnych i stacjonarnych z mieszkańcami w całej Polsce uczymy rozwagi finansowej i ostrzegamy przed zagrożeniami. Kształcimy studentów w zakresie prawnej ochrony konsumentów. W tym celu tworzymy Akademię Rzecznika Finansowego. Codziennie stoimy na straży Waszych finansów. Rzecznik finansowy jest niezależną instytucją. Pomagamy poprzez bezpłatne porady, interwencje oraz pomoc w procesach sądowych osobom będącym w sporach z bankami i firmami ubezpieczeniowymi. Naszym kapitałem jest zaangażowany zespół wykwalifikowanych prawników. Na nasz wniosek Sąd Najwyższy rozstrzyga w wątpliwych sprawach, często na korzyść konsumenta. Rzecznik Generalny TSUE przychylił się do stanowiska rzecznika finansowego w głośnej sprawie kredytów frankowych. Wspieramy obywateli, prowadząc szybkie i tanie postępowania ugodowe. Stanowią one alternatywę dla długotrwałych i kosztownych postępowań sądowych. Aktywnie uczestniczymy w tworzeniu prawa tak, aby przepisy jak najlepiej chroniły interesy klientów instytucji finansowych. Podczas spotkań zdalnych i stacjonarnych z mieszkańcami w całej Polsce uczymy rozwagi finansowej i ostrzegamy przed zagrożeniami. Kształcimy studentów w zakresie prawnej ochrony konsumentów. W tym celu tworzymy Akademię Rzecznika Finansowego. Codziennie stoimy na straży Waszych finansów. Rzecznik Finansowy jest niezależną instytucją. Pomagamy poprzez bezpłatne porady, interwencje oraz pomoc w procesach sądowych osobom będącym w sporach z bankami i firmami ubezpieczeniowymi. Naszym kapitałem jest zaangażowany zespół wykwalifikowanych prawników. Na nasz wniosek Sąd Najwyższy rozstrzyga w wątpliwych sprawach, często na korzyść konsumenta. Rzecznik Generalny TSUE przychylił się do stanowiska rzecznika finansowego w głośnej sprawie kredytów frankowych. Wspieramy obywateli, prowadząc szybkie i tanie postępowania ugodowe. Stanowią one alternatywę dla długotrwałych i kosztownych postępowań sądowych. Aktywnie uczestniczymy w tworzeniu prawa tak, aby przepisy jak najlepiej chroniły interesy klientów instytucji finansowych. Podczas spotkań zdalnych i stacjonarnych z mieszkańcami w całej Polsce uczymy rozwagi finansowej i ostrzegamy przed zagrożeniami. Kształcimy studentów w zakresie prawnej ochrony konsumentów. W tym celu tworzymy Akademię Rzecznika Finansowego. Codziennie stoimy na straży Waszych finansów. Rzecznik Finansowy jest niezależną instytucją. Pomagamy poprzez bezpłatne porady, interwencje oraz pomoc w procesach sądowych osobom będącym w sporach z bankami i firmami ubezpieczeniowymi. Naszym kapitałem jest zaangażowany zespół wykwalifikowanych prawników. Na nasz wniosek Sąd Najwyższy rozstrzyga w wątpliwych sprawach, często na korzyść konsumenta. Rzecznik Generalny TSUE przychylił się do stanowiska rzecznika finansowego w głośnej sprawie kredytów frankowych. Wspieramy obywateli, prowadząc szybkie i tanie postępowania ugodowe. Stanowią one alternatywę dla długotrwałych i kosztownych postępowań sądowych. Aktywnie uczestniczymy w tworzeniu prawa tak, aby przepisy jak najlepiej chroniły interesy klientów instytucji finansowych. Podczas spotkań zdalnych i stacjonarnych z mieszkańcami w całej Polsce uczymy rozwagi finansowej i ostrzegamy przed zagrożeniami. Kształcimy studentów w zakresie prawnej ochrony konsumentów. W tym celu tworzymy Akademię Rzecznika Finansowego. Codziennie stoimy na straży Waszych finansów. Rzecznik Finansowy jest niezależną instytucją. Pomagamy poprzez bezpłatne porady, interwencje oraz pomoc w procesach sądowych osobom będącym w sporach z bankami i firmami ubezpieczeniowymi. Naszym kapitałem jest zaangażowany zespół wykwalifikowanych prawników. Na nasz wniosek Sąd Najwyższy rozstrzyga w wątpliwych sprawach, często na korzyść konsumenta. Rzecznik Generalny TSUE przychylił się do stanowiska rzecznika finansowego w głośnej sprawie kredytów frankowych. Wspieramy obywateli, prowadząc szybkie i tanie postępowania ugodowe. Stanowią one alternatywę dla długotrwałych i kosztownych postępowań sądowych. Aktywnie uczestniczymy w tworzeniu prawa tak, aby przepisy jak najlepiej chroniły interesy klientów instytucji finansowych. Podczas